Hi everyone. Welcome back to our literature lessons. My name is Percy, and at this point, we are focusing on literary criticism. Now, if you are a more advanced student of literature, maybe you're in graduate school, you're taking masters or doctorate in literature, maybe this is not the lesson that you're looking for because you are into much more complicated, quote unquote, and deeper scholarly discourses on philosophy and literature. But this one is intended for basic theory and criticism in literature. In this particular episode, we will talk about historical biographical approaches and moral philosophical approaches as part of the traditional approach in literary theory and criticism. So we have the historical approach and the biographical approach. The historical approach, from its definition or from the word itself, history, deals with the historical context or background of the text. And the biographical approach, on the other hand, is now the approach that deals with the author and his or her time, context, and milieu. We'll talk about that quickly, but this approach sees a literary work chiefly, if not exclusively, as a reflection of the author's life and time or the life and times of the characters in the literary text or in that particular work that we're studying. In short, historical biographical approaches and moral philosophical approaches are approaches in literary criticism that deals with the author's time and its historical context. So one might be asking in reading a specific literary text, who wrote that particular text and what was happening in his or her life during the time he wrote that particular text, and what was the immediate context, what was the historical background of that particular time where the author wrote that specific literary text. A French critic and historian in the 19th century who particularly worked in French Revolution and other historical accounts, Hippolyte Adolphe Taine, I don't know if I pronounced the French name right, but that critic emphasizes three important elements in the historical and biographical approaches, namely race, milieu, and moment. Okay, race, milieu, et moment. I'm not quite sure with the French. Race, milieu, and moment, the three principal motives or conditioning factors behind any work of art, according to Taine, sought to establish a scientific approach to literature through the investigation of what created the individual who created the work of art. In short, we're saying that in the historical biographical approach, the author is a product of his or her environment or context or historical background. Probably his or her race, what was happening during that time, his social constructs, if you may, and other factors that needs to be considered, as the person or the author is a product of these things. And that means that in the historical biographical approach, the author, as a product of his or her context, produces literary text that is also a product of or reflection of the author, as the author is a reflection of its historical context. The literature of a culture, according to Taine, will show the most sensitive and unguarded displays of motive and the psychology of a people. It reflects what was happening during that context, during that time. So if you, for example, encounter a character in a short story, in a novel, that has shown certain behavior that, according to the historical biographical approach, may be a reflection of what was happening in that time the author wrote that specific text. By race, Hippolyte Taine meant the inherited disposition or temperament that persists stubbornly over thousands of years. How we read and understand someone's writing may also be influenced either by the race of the writer or the author, or the race of the character presented in the text, or our own personal race, because we have these social structures, the way we understand the text may be also informed or influenced by our own context in relation to the context of the author as well. So the key here is context, particularly historical context. Right. So that's what we mean by race. Of course, it's debatable in so many scholarly work in literature and literary criticism. But what Hippolyte is simply saying here is that the race of the writer informs his writing, or the context in general of the writer informs his or her writing. What about the milieu? The milieu, according to Hippolyte, talks about circumstances or environment that modify the inherited racial disposition. So it talks about social movements, let's say, or social environment, political, cultural, religious, name it, etc. What was the overall political climate during the time that was written or the text was written? What was some dominant culture being practiced during the time it was written by the author? What was some religious concerns or restrictions, if you may? If not, what are some of the social movements happening in the text that are present in that specific text that you are reading, which is a reflection of what was happening during the time of the author or the time it was written? So race, milieu, and now we have moment. According to Taine, moment meant the momentum of past and present cultural traditions. The race and the milieu combined together is what makes the moment, okay, or the momentum of the past and the present considered in that specific text. Okay, so again, it's the momentum of past and present cultural traditions. That when you look, for example, at writings during Civil War, or even fiction during World War I or II, you would see some of the struggles, some of the disbelief, the disillusionment of people back then as reflected in the story or in the character. So the window for us to understand history and the author is through literature. That is the traditional approach, the historical and the biographical approach to literature. The life of the author, the historical events, and the values of his or her age help us understand the work, and in a similar way, the literary work gives information to the author and his own period. So the literature gives us an understanding of the context, right? In the same manner that the context gives us an understanding of the literary text. So in doing historical biographical approach, it is basic that you study the author, look at some researches about his or her life, where he or she studies, what was his or her belief religiously, culturally, what are some significant moments in the life of the author that influenced the writing. And in the same manner, look at what was happening during the time the text was written or produced. We also have part of the traditional approaches in literature, the moral and philosophical approaches. Have you ever had literature courses or classes, lessons, where your professor or your teacher, after talking about the text, ask you questions like, what is the moral of the lesson? Or what is the moral lesson in Filipino? You always say that, no? What's the moral of the lesson? What can you learn from the life of the author? What can you learn from the life of the characters? Or what can you learn from this piece of poetry or drama? These are coming from that traditional approach in literary criticism called the moral and philosophical approaches. The basic position of such critics is that the larger function of literature is to teach, or to moralize, to teach morality, and to probe philosophical issues. They would interpret literature within a context of the philosophical thought of a period or a group. So similar to historical biographical approach, one of the things that we want to see in studying the historical context or the biographical context is the dominant teaching of morality or religious perspective, if you may, if not some ethical considerations. And because the assumed goal of literature is to teach, or to be didactic, to moralize, or to teach us lessons in the traditional sense, we are hence looking for moral and philosophical approaches as an anchor for us to be able to understand the literary text. The assumption for the moral philosophical approach is that literature should be delightful and instructive. There's this term called dulce et utile. If I'm not mistaken, it's Latin. It means it should delight, dulce, and utile, utilize. It should delight and be utilized. In short, literature should be pleasurable, which is in some philosophical sense very Platonic and very Samuel Taylor Coleridge in nature. It should be pleasurable, but at the same time it should be instructive. It should teach us something. Dulce et utile, to delight and to instruct, to be pleasurable and to teach us certain lesson. That is the assumption of literature, or the assumption for literature in the traditional sense. It interprets literature within a context of the philosophical thoughts of a period or a group. Maybe a philosophical movement during that time, or maybe the philosophical perspective of a group of people, or just the author, him or herself, right? Maybe a family thing, maybe like something that the author wants to criticize as well. So these are reflected in the moral philosophical approaches in literature. Matthew Arnold, one figure in literature and cultural studies, says that a great literary work must possess high seriousness, right? It must possess high seriousness. To be considered part of the great canon of literature, according to Matthew Arnold, the literary text should possess high seriousness. It should be moral and philosophical. It should be pleasurable. It should be written in good language. It should instruct. In each instance, critics working from a moral bent are not unaware of form, figurative language, and other purely aesthetic considerations. But the important thing is that the moral and the philosophical teaching is present in the text. Okay, so it is pleasurable, but it should be instructing. It should be teaching us about morality and philosophy. Now, as we reflect on the historical, biographical, and the moral philosophical, or what we call the traditional approaches to literary criticism, let's also consider that probably the enemies of the traditional approach to literary analysis have argued that it has tended to be let's say, somewhat deficient in imagination. It's like you automatically looking for the lesson. It's like you automatically looking for the moral side or the teaching side of literature, probably neglecting the other sides of literature. In the historical, biographical, and the moral philosophical approaches, those devices in literature are not the main concern. The concern is the context and the way it teaches us. Right? It has nevertheless performed one valuable service in avoiding, let's say, cultism or like forming a cult in terms of reading, that I will only read in an existentialist manner. I will only read in a post-structuralist deconstruction manner, because the challenge for 20th century and modern theories and criticism is that it somehow allows readers to only read in that particular point of view. If, for example, you are a structuralist reader, you will only you have the tendency to only read the text using structuralism. So it, in a way, forms some form of a quote-unquote cult in literature, that you are the reader who's only deconstructing. You are the reader who's only looking at the psychoanalysis part. Okay? So indeed, in some sense, these approaches, historical, biographical, and moral philosophical approaches, represent a necessary first step or foundation that precedes among other approaches. I hope you learned something today in our traditional approaches to literary theory and criticism. See you in our next episodes as we talk about the different approaches and philosophical movements in literary theory and criticism. Again, this is Percy, and happy reading.